Then for 27 years, one man woke up every morning in a 6x9 concrete box, knowing the state could kill him. Not because of fingerprints, not because of DNA, not because of a confession, not even because of a witness, because of teeth marks that a dentist claimed he could read like a fingerprint, teeth marks that, according to this expert, could only have come from one person in the entire world, teeth marks that matched, with scientific certainty, the teeth of Jimmy Duncan. The expert testified, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, these marks were made by the defendant's teeth. I can exclude every other person on earth. The jury believed him. The judge sentenced Jimmy Duncan to death. But here's what that jury never saw. Here's what the defense attorney never knew. Here's the secret that would stay hidden for more than 2 decades. The expert had created the bite marks himself, on camera, in the morgue, after the child was already dead. While Jimmy Duncan sat on Louisiana death row, the world outside moved on. Seasons changed, technology evolved, families grew older, prison walls stayed the same, and the only thing standing between him and that execution chamber was a lie told by men in white lab coats, a lie that courts accepted as science, a lie that nearly cost an innocent man his life. But years later, after decades of damage, those very experts would be exposed as frauds, their methods torn apart by real scientists, their testimony called junk science by judges, their cases collapsing one by one across the American South. And suddenly, the question no one wanted to ask became impossible to ignore. How many innocent people did they help send to death row? How many are still there right now? This is the story of one of them. This is the story of how fake forensics became a death sentence. And this is the story of 27 years stolen by men who called themselves scientists. Jimmy Duncan went by Chris. Most people who knew him called him Chris. Some called him Jimmy. Either way, he was just a regular guy trying to make it in rural Louisiana in the early 1990s. He was 34 years old in 1993. He worked odd jobs, construction, painting, manual labor, whatever he could find. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't educated. He wasn't connected to anyone with power. He was a black man in the Deep South, living paycheck to paycheck, doing his best. He lived with his girlfriend, Mary Olivo. They'd been together for a while, not married, but together, building a life. Mary had a daughter from a previous relationship, a little girl named Haley. Haley was 23 months old, almost 2 years old, just learning to talk in full sentences, starting to have a personality, curious about everything. Chris wasn't Haley's biological father, but he was there. He helped take care of her, changed diapers, fed her, played with her, gave her baths. People who knew them said he was good with her, patient, gentle. This was Chris Duncan's life in September 1993. Ordinary, unremarkable, just trying to get by. And he had no idea that in a matter of days, his entire existence would be destroyed. September 28, 1993. That's the day everything ended. It was a Tuesday evening. Mary was at work. Chris was home with Haley. This was normal. He'd taken care of her plenty of times before. Around 7 p.m., Chris decided to give Haley a bath. He ran the water, put her in the tub. She played with bath toys. And then, according to Chris, the phone rang. Or maybe he stepped into the other room for something. The exact details vary depending on which statement you read. But the essential fact is this. Chris left the bathroom for a moment, and when he came back, Haley wasn't breathing. He pulled her out of the water. She was limp, unresponsive. He started screaming. He tried CPR, or what he thought was CPR. He wasn't trained, but he tried. 911 operator, 911. What's your emergency? Chris Duncan. My baby, she's not breathing. I need help. Operator. Okay, sir, stay calm. What happened? Chris. I don't know, she was in the bath. I came back and she's not breathing. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They took over, started chest compressions, bagged her, tried to get her breathing. They rushed her to the hospital. Chris rode with them or followed behind. Accounts differ. But he was there, frantic, terrified. The ER doctors worked on Haley for over an hour. They tried everything, but her brain had been without oxygen for too long. At 9:17 p.m., they called it, Haley Olivo was pronounced dead. Chris Duncan sat in that hospital hallway, destroyed. A little girl he'd helped raise was gone, and at that moment, all he felt was grief. He had no idea that within hours, that grief would turn into suspicion, and that suspicion would turn into a death sentence. The initial assumption was drowning, a tragic accident, a momentary lapse in supervision that ended in heartbreak. It happens, more often than people want to admit. But then the doctors started looking closer. The medical examiner, Dr. Stephen Hain, performed the autopsy the next day. Dr. Hain was one of the busiest pathologists in Mississippi and Louisiana. He performed thousands of autopsies. Some years he did over 1,500, far more than most pathologists handle. He was efficient. He was trusted. Courts relied on him. And during Haley's autopsy, Dr. Hain found bruising, marks on her body, some on her arms, some on her chest. Signs of what he believed was trauma. To Dr. Hain, these weren't the marks of an accidental drowning. These were the marks of abuse. And once that determination was made, everything changed. The police were notified. This wasn't an accident investigation anymore. This was a homicide investigation. And Chris Duncan, the man who had called 911, who had tried to save her, who had been there when she died, became the primary suspect. Why Chris? Because he was the caregiver at the time. Because he was the last person alone with her. Because in cases like this, it's almost always someone close to the child. And because, let's be honest, he was a black man in rural Louisiana with no money and no power. An easy target. The detectives questioned him for hours. He told them what happened. The bath, the phone, coming back to find her not breathing. He was cooperative. He answered their questions. They gave him a polygraph test. The results were inconclusive, which in the minds of investigators meant deceptive. Tell us what really happened, Chris. I did tell you. You're lying. I'm not lying. But here's the problem the police had. They didn't have hard evidence. No witnesses saw Chris hurt Haley. No confession, no weapon, no clear mechanism of death that definitively pointed to murder. They had suspicions, they had theories, but they didn't have proof. And that's when Dr. Hain made a phone call. He called a colleague, a man he'd worked with many times before, a forensic odontologist, a dentist who claimed he could analyze bite marks. His name was Dr. Michael West, and his arrival would change everything. To understand how Chris Duncan ended up on death row, you need to understand the empire that Dr. Michael West and Dr. Stephen Hain built across the American South. Together, these two men worked on hundreds, possibly thousands of criminal cases. Hain did the autopsies. West analyzed the bite marks. And together, they sent people to prison. Dr. Stephen Hain was a pathologist. He performed autopsies for multiple counties in Mississippi and Louisiana because there weren't enough medical examiners to cover the entire region. At his peak, Hain was performing over 1,500 autopsies per year. That's more than 4 autopsies every single day. The National Association of Medical Examiners recommends a maximum of 250 per year for quality and accuracy. Hain was doing 6 times that amount, and he testified in court constantly. Prosecutors loved him because he was reliable. He showed up. He said what they needed him to say. Defense attorneys hated him because he was impossible to challenge. He had credentials. He had experience. Juries believed him. Dr. Michael West was different. He was a dentist who'd gotten interested in forensic odontology, the study of bite marks in criminal investigations. He claimed he could identify bite marks that other experts couldn't see. He used special lighting, special photography techniques, dental molds, and he testified with absolute certainty. These marks were made by human teeth. These marks match the defendant's dental pattern. I can exclude every other person on earth. To juries in the 1980s and 1990s, this sounded like science. It sounded sophisticated, technical, reliable. Why would a doctor lie? Why would an expert make it up? West testified in case after case after case, rapes, murders, assaults, and his testimony was often the key evidence. Sometimes the only evidence, But decades later, investigators would discover something disturbing. Many of those cases were wrong. The bite marks West identified weren't bite marks at all. The matches he claimed were impossible, and the people he helped convict were innocent. But in 1993, when Chris Duncan's case was being built, none of that was known yet. West and Hain were at the height of their power. Trusted, respected, unchallenged. And when Dr. Hain called West to examine Haley Olivo's body, West knew exactly what to do. He'd done it many times before. Before we go further, you need to understand what bite mark analysis actually is, and more importantly, why it's not science. Real forensic science works like this. Fingerprints have unique patterns, ridge characteristics that don't change. They can be measured, compared, verified. DNA has unique sequences, genetic markers that are consistent. They can be tested, replicated, proven. These are real sciences with peer-reviewed research and standardized methods. Bite mark analysis is not like that. Here's what it claims to do. When someone bites skin, they supposedly leave a pattern. The forensic odontologist photographs this pattern. Then they compare it to the suspect's teeth using dental molds. If the patterns match, they testify that this specific person made the mark. Sounds scientific, right? Except for one problem. Skin isn't a stable surface. It stretches, it bruises, it swells, it changes shape after death. A mark that looks like teeth might be from something else entirely. A rash, a bruise, fabric, medical equipment, and even if it is a bite mark, different experts looking at the same mark will reach different conclusions. There's no standardized method, no objective measurement, no way to verify. Studies have shown that forensic odontologists can't even consistently identify whether a mark is a bite mark or not, let alone match it to a specific person. Even the American Board of Forensic Odontology, the organization that certifies these experts, now admits that bite marks should not be used to identify a specific individual. That's their own organization saying their method doesn't work. But in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, courts didn't know this. Judges allowed bite mark testimony, juries believed it, and people went to prison and to death row because of it. And Dr. Michael West was one of the most prolific bite mark analysts in the country. He testified that he could make identifications with certainty. He said his methods were scientific. He said he was never wrong, and courts believed him for decades until they didn't. On September 29, 1993, the day after Haley Olivo died, Dr. Michael West arrived at the morgue. Dr. Hain had already performed the autopsy and found bruising, but he wanted West's expertise to determine if any of those marks were bite marks. West brought his equipment, special lighting that he claimed could reveal marks invisible to the naked eye, high-resolution cameras, and dental molds, casts of Chris Duncan's teeth that police had already obtained. West spent hours examining Haley's body. He took photographs, dozens of them, and then he did something that wouldn't be discovered for more than 20 years. He turned on a video camera, and he recorded what happened next. On that tape, which would remain hidden from the defense, from the jury, from everyone except the prosecution, West took Chris Duncan's dental mold. He pressed it into Haley's skin, hard, deliberately, creating marks. He pressed the mold into her chest. He pressed it into her arm. He created the bite marks that he would later testify Chris Duncan had made. Then he photographed these marks, and those photographs showing marks that West himself had just created became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. West labeled the tape, filed it away, and never told anyone what it showed. The defense never knew the tape existed. They never knew that the bite marks had been fabricated. They never knew that the expert was creating the evidence he would testify about. This is a violation of every rule of evidence in legal ethics. Prosecutors are required to disclose exculpatory evidence, evidence that might prove innocence. A video showing that the key evidence was manufactured is about as exculpatory as it gets. But the tape stayed hidden, and the trial moved forward, and Chris Duncan had no idea that the case against him was built on a lie. Chris Duncan's trial began in 1994. He'd been in jail for months, couldn't make bail. His court-appointed attorney was overworked and underpaid, and he was facing the death penalty. The jury was selected. 12 people from the community, working people, no scientists, no experts. People who would be asked to evaluate testimony about dental patterns and forensic analysis. People who had no reason to doubt a doctor. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They argued that Chris Duncan had abused Haley Olivo, that he had bitten her multiple times, that he had caused injuries that led to her death. They showed the jury photos of Haley's body, photos of the bruising, the marks, and they told the jury that those marks were proof of murder. Their first expert witness was Dr. Stephen Hain. He testified that Haley's injuries were consistent with abuse, that the bruising suggested force, that this was not an accidental drowning. He spoke with medical authority, used technical terms, pathology jargon, sounded convincing. The defense attorney cross-examined him, but what could he say? He wasn't a doctor. He couldn't challenge the medical findings effectively, and Hain had performed thousands of autopsies. His credentials were solid. Then came the star witness, Dr. Michael West. West was a performer. He didn't just testify. He educated. He engaged. He made the jury feel like they were learning science. He showed them enlarged photographs of the marks on Haley's body. Then he showed them photographs of Chris Duncan's dental pattern, and he walked them through his analysis. You can see here, he said, pointing, the pattern of the upper incisors, the spacing, the unique characteristics. The jury watched intently. This looked like science. It sounded like science. In my professional opinion, West testified, these marks were made by human teeth, specifically by the defendant's teeth. I can exclude every other person on Earth. Every other person on Earth. That's how certain he claimed to be. Chris sat at the defense table and watched his life being destroyed by lies presented as science. The defense attorney tried to challenge West. How can you be certain? Because of the pattern characteristics. But couldn't these marks be from something else? No, I'm certain these are bite marks. West had testified hundreds of times. He knew how to handle cross-examination. He deflected. He used technical language. He never showed doubt. In closing arguments, the prosecutor tied it all together. Ladies and gentlemen, we have two medical experts who have told you what happened. Dr. Hain, a pathologist with decades of experience. Dr. West, a forensic odontologist who has identified the defendant's bite marks on this child's body with absolute certainty. This little girl didn't drown by accident. She was abused, and the science proves that this man, pointing at Chris, was responsible. The jury deliberated. They discussed the evidence, the testimony, the photos. They trusted the experts. Why wouldn't they? When they returned, the foreman stood. The judge asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus Jimmy Duncan, on the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find?" "Guilty." Chris Duncan didn't react. He sat perfectly still. At sentencing, the judge had no mercy. This was a child. The evidence was overwhelming. The experts had spoken. "I hereby sentence you to death." Chris was let out of the courtroom. His family collapsed in grief, and he was transported to Louisiana State Penitentiary, to death row, to wait to die for a crime he didn't commit. Louisiana State Penitentiary, known as Angola, named after the plantation that once stood on this land. 18,000 acres, 6,300 inmates. One of the largest maximum security prisons in the United States. And within Angola, there's a separate unit, death row, where Louisiana keeps the men it plans to kill. This is where Chris Duncan would spend the next 27 years of his life. In a cell 6 feet wide and 9 feet long, smaller than most people's bathrooms. A metal bed bolted to the wall, a thin mattress, one blanket, a stainless steel toilet sink combination. No privacy. Guards can see everything. One small window, high up on the wall. Through it, if he stood on his bed, Chris could see a slice of sky. That was his view of the outside world. Every day was exactly the same. Wake up at 5:30 a.m., not by choice. The lights come on, the noise begins. Breakfast comes on a tray slid under the door. Cold eggs, grits, a piece of bread. Lukewarm coffee, 23 hours a day in that cell. Reading, if you have books, writing letters, if you have stamps, thinking, remembering, trying not to lose your mind. 1 hour per day for recreation, which means being moved to a slightly larger cage outside, sometimes alone, sometimes with one other inmate, still caged, still watched. Guards controlled everything. When you ate, when you showered, when you spoke, you had no autonomy, no choices, no control over your own existence. And periodically, sometimes months apart, sometimes weeks, someone would be executed. An inmate Chris knew would be moved to a holding cell. Last meals would be prepared. The execution chamber was in the same building, close enough that you could hear the preparations, close enough that you knew it was happening. And every time someone was executed, Chris knew it could be him next. Time moves differently on death row. Days blur together because they're all the same. But somehow years pass. 1994 became 1995. The world outside was watching the O.J. Simpson trial. Chris was in a cell. 1999 became 2000. The world celebrated a new millennium. Chris was in the same cell. September 11th, 2001. The world changed forever. Chris learned about it days later, from other inmates. The internet exploded. Cell phones became smartphones. Social media was invented. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Chris's cell stayed exactly the same. He wrote letters to his family. He wrote letters to his family, his mother, his siblings, friends who still remembered him. They wrote back, sent photos. And through those photos, Chris watched life happen without him. Nieces and nephews he'd never met growing up. His mother getting older. Then sick. Then his mother died in 2006. He wasn't allowed to attend her funeral. Death row inmates don't get to leave for funerals. He learned about it in a letter, and he grieved alone, in a 6x9 cell. Unable to say goodbye, his siblings visited when they could. But prison visits are hard. You have to take time off work, drive hours, go through security, sit in a room separated by glass, talk through a phone with a time limit, touch the glass where their hand is on the other side. And over the years, visits became less frequent, not because people stopped caring, but because 27 years is a very long time to hold on to hope. Chris Duncan turned 40 on death row, then 50, then 60. He watched himself age in a small metal mirror, watched his hair turn gray, watched his face show the years, watched himself become an old man in a cage. By 2020, the world Chris left in 1993 didn't exist anymore. Everything had changed. Technology, culture, politics. His cell hadn't changed at all. But Chris Duncan wasn't the only person Dr. Michael West helped convict. He was just one case in a system-wide problem. In 2001, a man named Kennedy Brewer was convicted of raping and murdering a 3-year-old girl named Christine Jackson in Mississippi. The key evidence? Dr. Michael West's bite mark testimony. West testified that bite marks on the child's body matched Brewer's teeth. He said it with certainty. The jury believed him. Kennedy Brewer was sentenced to death. He went to death row, just like Chris Duncan, based on the same expert, using the same junk science. But years later, DNA testing became available. DNA that hadn't been tested during the original investigation. The DNA excluded Kennedy Brewer completely. He couldn't have committed the rape. In 2008, Kennedy Brewer was exonerated and released. He'd spent 15 years in prison, 7 of them on death row, for a crime he didn't commit. The real killer was eventually found. Justin Albert Johnson. He confessed to multiple murders, including Christine Jackson's murder. Dr. Michael West had been wrong. Completely, catastrophically. An innocent man had nearly been executed because of his testimony. But it gets worse. In 1992, a man named LaVon Brooks had been convicted of a remarkably similar crime. Another 3-year-old girl murdered in the same Mississippi county. Same medical examiner, Dr. Stephen Hain. Same bite mark expert, Dr. Michael West. West testified that bite marks on that victim matched LaVon Brooks's teeth. Brooks was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Years later, DNA testing excluded Levon Brooks too. The real killer was the same man, Justin Albert Johnson. He had committed both murders. Two different men had been convicted, both based on Dr. Michael West's bite mark testimony. Both were innocent. Levon Brooks was released in 2008 after 16 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Kennedy Brewer and Levon Brooks, two innocent men convicted of crimes committed by the same killer, both on the testimony of the same expert, met for the first time after their release. Three men, all black, all from the Deep South, all convicted on Dr. Michael West's bite mark testimony, all innocent. And those are just the cases we know about. Dr. Michael West testified in dozens, perhaps hundreds of cases. How many others were wrong? How many people are still in prison right now because a jury believed him? When Chris Duncan learned about these exonerations, something shifted. He wasn't just one man wrongly convicted. He was part of a pattern, a system-wide failure. And if Brewer and Brooks got out, maybe he could too. By the 2000s, the scientific community was turning against bite mark analysis, not quietly, loudly. In 2009, the National Academy of Sciences released a comprehensive report on forensic science. It examined methods used in courtrooms across America, and it found that many of them, including bite mark analysis, lack scientific foundation. The report stated, the scientific basis of bite mark analysis is questionable. There is no science on the reproducibility of the different methods of analysis. No justification for claiming that bite mark analysis can definitively identify a perpetrator. In 2016, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology issued another report. It was even more damning. It concluded that bite mark analysis has no scientific validity for identifying perpetrators. It recommended that courts stop allowing bite mark testimony altogether. Even the American Board of Forensic Odontology, the very organization that certifies bite mark experts, revised its standards. They now admit that bite marks cannot be used to identify a specific person. Courts in Texas, California, and other states began rejecting bite mark evidence. Convictions were overturned. Experts were discredited. Dr. Michael West's reputation collapsed. He was barred from testifying in some jurisdictions. His methods were publicly questioned. And from death row, Chris Duncan read these news reports. And for the first time in decades, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. In the 2000s, lawyers from the Innocence Project and other organizations began reviewing old cases involving Dr. Michael West. Chris Duncan's case was on that list. They requested all the files, trial transcripts, autopsy reports, evidence logs, everything. And buried in the evidence storage was a box that hadn't been opened in years. Inside that box was a VHS tape. The label read, Haley Olivo, Forensic Analysis, Dr. Michael West. The defense had never known this tape existed. It had never been disclosed. The lawyers put the tape in a VHS player, and they watched. At first, it looked like standard forensic documentation. West examining the body, taking photographs. But then, West picked up Chris Duncan's dental mold, and he pressed it into Haley's skin, hard, deliberately, creating indentations. The lawyer watching felt her stomach drop. This was it. This was proof that the bite marks had been fabricated. She watched it again and again, taking notes, screen capturing. This was the evidence that would free Chris Duncan. The legal team convened. They brought in expert forensic odontologists, real scientists, not courtroom hired guns. The experts watched the tape, and they were appalled. This is not forensic analysis. This is evidence fabrication. These marks were created by Dr. West, not by the defendant. This invalidates his entire testimony. Chris's legal team drafted a motion to vacate his conviction. They attached the video. They attached expert affidavits. They presented evidence that bite mark analysis is junk science. And they argued that Chris Duncan had been convicted based on fabricated evidence that was withheld from the defense. The motion was filed, and then they waited. The hearing took place in 2024, more than 30 years after Chris's conviction. Chris was brought from Angola to the courthouse. He was 65 years old now. gray-haired, weathered by decades in a cell, but his eyes showed something they hadn't in years. Hope. Chris's attorneys presented the video. They showed the judge exactly what Dr. West had done. The judge watched, silent, focused. Then they called expert witnesses. Dr. Adam Freeman, a forensic odontologist, testified, "Bite mark analysis has been thoroughly discredited. It is not scientifically valid. It cannot identify a specific individual. And in this case, the marks weren't even naturally occurring. They were created by Dr. West himself. This conviction is built on fraud." Dr. Mary Bush, a forensic pathologist, reviewed Haley's autopsy. The injuries described could have multiple causes: drowning, resuscitation attempts, post-mortem changes. The conclusion that these were bite marks, and specifically the defendant's bite marks, is not supported by science. The prosecution tried to defend the conviction, but what could they say? The video showed what it showed. The science had been debunked. Dr. West himself had been discredited in dozens of other cases. They argued that the jury had made their decision based on the evidence available at the time. That new science shouldn't overturn old convictions. Chris's attorney responded, "The evidence wasn't just available at the time, it was fabricated and then hidden. The prosecution had a video showing Dr. West creating these marks, and they never disclosed it. That's not a question of evolving science. That's a violation of constitutional rights." The judge took time to review everything. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Chris went back to death row. And he waited, like he'd been waiting for 27 years. But this time felt different. April 2025. The courtroom was packed. Media, family members, lawyers, advocates, everyone waiting for Judge Alvin Sharp's ruling. Judge Sharp entered, serious, deliberate. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He began reading his ruling. After reviewing the evidence presented, including the video footage and expert testimony, this court finds that the conviction of Jimmy Duncan was based on forensic evidence that has been thoroughly discredited. Bite mark analysis, as practiced by Dr. Michael West, is not scientifically defensible. Furthermore, the video evidence shows that Dr. West created the very marks he later testified were made by the defendant. This is fabrication of evidence. The prosecution's failure to disclose this video to the defense is a violation of Brady v. Maryland and the defendant's constitutional rights. Therefore, the conviction is hereby overturned. The courtroom erupted. Family members sobbed. Chris's attorneys hugged each other. Chris Duncan sat perfectly still for a moment, and then for the first time in 27 years, he cried. The state had to decide, retry Chris or let him go. But they had no case, no bite marks, no evidence, no witnesses. The prosecution announced they would not seek a retrial. Chris Duncan was free. November 2025, 27 years, 8 months, and 14 days after he entered Louisiana State Penitentiary's death row. Chris Duncan walked out. The gates opened. Sunlight, real sunlight, not filtered through a tiny window, hit his face. He took a step forward, then another. His family was waiting. His brother, his sister, nieces and nephews he'd never met. They ran to him. They held each other, crying, laughing, overwhelmed. Chris looked around, at the sky, so much bigger than the slice he'd seen through his cell window, at the trees, at the world, at freedom. He was 66 years old. He'd entered death row at 39, 27 years, 9,855 days, 236,520 hours. Gone. Chris Duncan is free, but freedom after 27 years in a cage is not simple. The world he left in 1993 doesn't exist anymore. There were no smartphones then, no internet, no GPS, no social media. He has to learn how to use a touchscreen, how to navigate apps, how to do things that everyone else takes for granted. He goes to a grocery store and it's overwhelming. Too many choices, too much noise, too many people. Loud noises startle him. Car horns, sirens, even doors slamming. Open spaces feel wrong after decades in a 6x9 cell. Crowds are terrifying. He has PTSD. He's in therapy. He's trying to rebuild a life. And he's fighting for compensation, Louisiana has a law that provides compensation for wrongful convictions, but it's limited, bureaucratic, capped. Even if he gets the maximum, it works out to about $25,000 per year for 27 years on death row, for nearly 3 decades stolen, for a life he can never get back. He's trying to reconnect with family, but decades create distance. These relationships have to be rebuilt. And he looks in the mirror and sees an old man, someone who lost his 40s, his 50s, and most of his 60s. Someone who will never get those years back. But Chris Duncan is one of the lucky ones. He got out. Others haven't. Dr. Michael West testified in dozens of cases. Dr. Stephen Hain performed thousands of autopsies. How many of those cases were wrong? How many people are sitting in cells right now, some on death row, based on West and Hain's testimony? How many cases will never be reviewed? And how many people were executed before the truth came out? Dr. Michael West has never been prosecuted. He's never faced criminal charges for fabricating evidence. He's never been held accountable. Dr. Stephen Hain retired. He too has faced no criminal consequences. They destroyed lives. They sent innocent people to prison. They helped sentence men to death. And they faced no punishment. That's the system. 27 years on death row, built on bite marks one man created and called science. Presented with certainty, revealed as fraud. This is what happens when courts trust experts without questioning them. When juries believe confidence over evidence. When the system values finality over truth. Bite mark analysis has been largely discredited now. Most courts won't allow it, but for decades it was accepted as reliable science. Thousands of cases relied on it. Some of those people have been exonerated, but how many are still waiting? And the men who built their careers on this junk science, they're free, comfortable, unpunished. Questions for you. Should people like Michael West and Stephen Hain face criminal charges for fabricating evidence? How should the system fix past cases based on junk science? What happens to the compensation Chris Duncan gets? Is $25,000 per year enough for 27 years on death row? Chris Duncan is 66 years old. He lost his 40s, his 50s, most of his 60s. His mother died while he was in prison. He couldn't say goodbye. He can never get those years back. Subscribe for more investigations into wrongful convictions, junk science, and how the system breaks innocent people. Next video, hair comparison analysis, the science that convicted hundreds and was never actually science. Because when science lies, it doesn't just steal years. It steals lives. Fade to black.